and welcome to this edition of the Midday Market Update for June 30th, 2020. It's the last day of the second quarter. My name is Kevin Hill. Here, as always, with Michael, Vincent.
Good afternoon, everyone.
In our twice-weekly interactive show. We're live on LinkedIn, FreightWaves TV, Facebook. So
yeah,
please
get your
comment,
questions and
drop
comments
us a
in.
line. Let us know any questions, comments that you have, and we will respond to those accordingly. So,
absolutely.
It is. It's a
good show today. It is the last day of the quarter.
Show.
We were just talking about, you said, what a quarter it's been, right?
It has, you know. Very little volatility, you know. Nothing happening in the world.
Yeah, kind of boring, you know.
It might be the most disruptive quarter in history, right?
First half, yeah, and,
really
and second
is.
quarter. There's no doubt about it. So
but we have a great show
wonder
today.
what the third and fourth have in store for us, brother. But
yes, I know. We have a great show to close out the second quarter for you today. Though at 12:30 we have Judah Levine, research lead at Freightos Group, joining us via Skype, and then Steve Viscelli, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, is a fellow and lecturer there. But first we have the headlines, and then we have some talk about the freight markets with our Director of Freight Market Intelligence, Zach Strickland, and then the economy. A little bit talk about the economy with our lead economist, Anthony Smith.
yeah.
But let's start it off right now with the headlines of the day with Andrew Cox, our research analyst here at FreightWaves. And we have a police matter to start us off, don't we, Andrew?
Yeah, pretty wild story to start the day, Kevin. This comes from John Kingston. He writes about a driver bobtailing in northeast Pennsylvania that took state police on a wild chase, which ended in him being killed after a lengthy standoff. This all happened yesterday. The truck was pulled over, but the driver that was pulled over by police was not the driver that took the police on this multi-mile long chase down I-81. That driver, towards Hazleton, excuse me. See, the driver was stopped. The truck was stopped and the driver exited, and then the passenger remained in the vehicle, the police report said. When the police identified the passenger as the person they were seeking on the parole violation, he refused to get out of the tractor and then subsequently took off. The driver, Wade Messeberger, 48 years old, out of Indiana, was being pursued by the U.S. Marshal's Office on suspicion of a violation of probation from an earlier homicide conviction, according to the police report on the incident distributed by the Pennsylvania State Police. Home video obtained by local news reports shows a wild scene in which the bobtailing tractor speeds through local streets in Hazleton, but there the driver drove the truck onto a local street and became stuck on a grassy area near the city skating rink. A perimeter was then set up and a 3-hour standoff ensued. During that time, the fugitive refused to surrender and intermittently fired weapons from the vehicle towards the state troopers. The fugitive was then shot and killed. The craziness of the chase was captured in video and in the comment section of local residents of Hazleton, normally a quiet and peaceful town, who saw the truck flying through their city streets.
So yeah, you can find the video and the full story on Freightos.com. It's a little bit of a confusing story.
It's a little bit of a confusing story and a wild night in Hazleton, right?
A wild night, yeah. So it wasn't necessarily the truck driver, but
it wasn't the driver.
passenger.
They pulled over the truck. The truck driver got out. They identified the passenger as the guy they were looking for. He jumps in and takes off, and then, yeah.
Yeah, so what his...
The relationship with the truck driver, we have no clue, other than
no clue right
he was
now,
in the
yes.
truck with him right now.
Yeah. Our next headline is from John Kingston as well, and it's an appeal on Cardinal Transportation and kind of some legal ramifications. What do we have, Andrew?
Yeah, Kevin, Cardinal Transport, an Illinois-based carrier, is on the hook for its share of a more than $5 million award handed down by a lower court after a friend of an independent owner-operator who was in a lease agreement with Cardinal lost a leg while helping load metal rods onto a truck. In a split vote late last week, a 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals rejected Cardinal's request for a new trial. The man who lost his leg is Richard Edwards Jr., who was helping load metal rods in West Virginia onto a truck owned by Danny McGowan. McGowan was operating a forklift to load the rods, and one of them fell onto Edwards' foot. Edwards suffered severe pain and extensive injuries from the incident, including the amputation of his leg. The jury came in with a $5 million judgment in damages. Cardinal argued for a new trial because it said that the verdict went against the clear weight of the evidence that McGowan was acting outside the scope of his employment at the time of the accident.
An interesting story, right, Kevin?
It is. It kind of blurs the line. I asked it out on LinkedIn and
I saw that.
Some good comments on that. You know, it kind of blurs the line between contract, you know, the control of a contractor at 1099, especially when he's intermingling other activity and businesses, and kind of bundling that up into a service, right? You know, where does liability begin?
Yeah. I mean, the way it was, he was picking up some loads, and then he had the ability or the agreement, or whether it was verbal or whatever, or whether Cardinal knew it or not, I don't know. But he was basically storing shipments and then combining them to one truck, and then paying drivers to move, and they can make more money. And I guess service wasn't an issue with this, whatever. It was more the fulfillment of getting them off the yard of the manufacturer or the shipper, right? And then he was also using a non-employee, a friend. To help him take these things off, and he got injured. So I'm not sure how that crosses back up to Cardinal. I'm not a lawyer, but I agree with you. It seems to blur some of those things. There's legality there, but it seems like someone was looking for pockets to me a little bit.
And I think we're going to have some legal opinions on this matter.
I would imagine
coming out next day or two on FreightWaves.com, as well, from transportation lawyers in the industry.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it'll be interesting to get that. We also have U.S.-Mexico truck traffic. The USMCA comes into effect starting tomorrow, July 1st. But the main numbers for cross-border traffic through especially Laredo were down quite a bit, weren't they, Andrew?
Yeah, Kevin, for the second straight month, international truck crossings dropped dramatically at the ports all across Texas. The World Trade and Columbia Solidarity bridges in Laredo, Texas, saw nearly 69,000 fewer commercial truck crossings from Mexico in May compared with May 2019. The 33% decline in truck traffic at the Port of Laredo was the second consecutive month of double-digit declines, with international crossings falling 21% in April. Analysts said Mexico's closure of auto assembly and component plants due to the pandemic has hampered supply chains across North America, which has led to decreases in the cross-border crossings.
Yeah, I was reading this, and I was going through Sonar, and to be clear, these double-digit decline, 33% and 21%, right? 33% decline in truck traffic, second month, 21% decline, et cetera. These are year-over-year numbers. They're not month-to-month numbers.
They are year-over-year.
They're year-over-year numbers. Now, May did decline a little bit from April. And most manufacturers didn't go back until end of May, right, and start right into now.
Yeah, the U.S. manufacturers, the Mexican
those parts are coming in from there as well,
they
right?
They shut down a little bit longer than that.
They were.
It's kind of those numbers in line what we saw in real-time activity for both April and May. They've since rebounded from that. But yeah, April and May were tough months for manufacturing industrials all over, and then the North American supply chain of automotive parts and supplies was a big
because we're looking at the outbound tender volumes for the Laredo markets, the El Paso markets, and even Brownsville, McAllen, that area, volumes are up, and right now they're above last year.
Yes.
Coming out of those markets, which would indicate that cross-border traffic has recovered quite a bit since the May numbers. I would suspect that the June numbers are going to show a much healthier June for those cross-border traffic.
Yes,
I would think, right?
Yeah, we definitely have. We also have John Gallagher talking about a truck trailer group accuses regulatories of trying to rewrite the emission laws. What do we have on that, Andrew?
Yeah, Kevin, trailer manufacturers are hitting back at efforts by federal regulators to define trailers as motor vehicles, as the equipment makers try to steer clear of additional costs resulting from new emission standards. In a June 23rd filing with the U.S. Court of Appeals, the Truck Trailer Manufacturers Association accused the EPA of a convoluted effort to rewrite a simple statute in order to regulate truck trailers. The Manufacturing Association's filing is the latest in a lawsuit initiated in December 2016, seeking a review of the Obama administration Phase 2 greenhouse gas standards issued in October of that year jointly by the EPA and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The rule imposed first-time fuel economy standards on trailers. The standards are set to go into effect January of next year. The TTMA contended that because trailers do not emit pollution, the two agencies lack the authority to regulate them, and the rule should not apply to them.
Would you like to comment first?
I'll let you. Okay. I'll let you take the ball on this one.
It's one of those where I see both sides arguing something that the end point makes sense to me. Okay, but both sides are arguing something that doesn't make any sense at all. One, a trailer is not autonomously. It can't move. It's not a self-propelled vehicle.
That is correct. Yes.
The trailer is not. Okay, so that's the one side. The other side, claiming that it doesn't have fuel economy and they are not under regulation, I think is also false. It absolutely does affect fuel economy.
It does.
It absolutely does. The skirts and the fins, etc., can improve
fuel economy.
Fuel economy, and should it or shouldn't it be regulated there's an argument of debate, but it's trying to say that it doesn't have an effect on fuel economy or it doesn't have its own fuel economy, therefore we don't fall under it. Might be right because of arguing semantic. It is not a self-propelled. But it is intended to be with the truck, and the overall trucks, the whole rig's economy and its carbon footprint is what we're talking about, right?
It is. It very much depends on the trailer and the aerodynamics of that, and other equipment that's on there. So you're exactly right. So it's kind of a strange thing, but they'll run it through the appeals courts.
They will.
Definitely, yeah. And we're going to round out the news with another marijuana bust on the Canadian border involving trucks. What do we have on that, Andrew?
Yeah, Kevin, the last one I've got for you is from Nate Tabak, our Canadian writer. He says a truck driver was arrested after U.S. border officers discovered marijuana valued at $20 million hidden in a tractor trailer. It was the largest drug bust at the U.S.-Canada border in 5 years, authorities said on Monday. U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers discovered nearly 10,000 pounds of marijuana during an inspection of the tractor trailer at the Peace Bridge border facility outside of Buffalo, New York. On June 25th. The marijuana was hidden in storage bin, the CBP said. The seizure marked the third major marijuana bust involving a truck on the U.S. side of the Peace Bridge in less than 1 month. It also came during an uptick in drug seizures at the U.S.-Canada border since it shut down for non-essential travel in March. U.S. federal prosecutors charged the driver, 26 years old, with possessing marijuana with the intent to distribute and importing marijuana into the U.S. Authorities did not release the name of the driver, but did say he was a Canadian resident.
They're going to have to step up their game if they want to compete with the coke traffickers on the high seas.
Though they are, yeah. That's like a second or third article that we've had on smuggling on the Canadian border. I think it sounds like it's really picking up.
And when I read this, there was a statement in there. Somebody had made that it was. I forget what they said. It was shocking and whatever during the current health crisis, which I don't know how the current health crisis has to do with this, other than I think the pickup in this is not that it's anything really new. There's just less traffic coming across, and it's easier to find it. I think that's one thing that has to do with it. The other is marijuana is legal in Canada, so they're going to smuggle it into the U.S. Who would have thought?
I know, right?
I mean, duh.
But before you take off, Andrew, you're on Great Quarter Guys today at 2 p.m. What are you talking about?
That's right, Kevin. I'll have JP Hampstead with me, the director of Passport Research. He and his team put out a 3PL Q2 preview last week, so he and I will be discussing kind of where the brokerage margins are going to be when those results come in the next couple of weeks when they report on their Q2 earnings, and what Q3 and Q4 may have in store for the big brokerages.
They'll be very interesting. I'll be tuned in to watch that as well to see what the outlook is for 3PLs. It's been as we said, Q2's been a wild quarter, so we'll see. Steve Ferrara says, here's our headline, right?
Okay.
June 24th to June 27th, 80,000 ocean invoices from China to U.S. June 27th to June 30th, 40,000 ocean invoices from China to USA. This is what's hurting ocean rates. Demand is plummeting, and we will talk to Freightos here in the bottom of the hour to talk
absolutely.
about that as well. And then Condesa Freight International, talking about Laredo. Not anymore. Laredo is in great shape, but it won't maintain. Be aware, asset-based carriers. Not sure the motives for the recent boom, Could you shed light on that? And maybe Zach Strickland might be able to shed some light on what's happening down in
the recent
in
increase of outbound coming out of Laredo, et cetera? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So, but we have Zach Strickland right now, our Director of Freight Market Intelligence here at FreightWaves, to discuss the freight markets.
Yes, here I am. So, yeah, the market, it's continuing to move in a different direction, than we saw the previous couple of years. We kind of expected volumes to moderate a little bit as we approach the holiday, because, you and I have discussed this, Mike, where we were seeing this return to seasonality to an extent. We're starting to see a very similar pattern, but not so fast. So this week, after having a little bit of a hiccup there over the weekend, things moderating a little bit, we're continuing to see growth in our outbound tender volume index. Even though it wasn't like some sort of huge jump yesterday, it was about a 1% increase in tender volumes, which again doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but it is this time of year. Traditionally, we see volumes start to moderate as we approach the holiday. They soften, if anything. They don't go up. Capacity tightens a good bit because, again, the supply side situation where a lot of people taking vacations, et cetera, that continues to be a thing. But the volumes increasing this time of year is somewhat of a new development. And, it's only going to make things more constrained as we approach the holiday. Tender rejection rates, whereas they might have moderated a little bit approaching July 4th this year, they probably will continue to increase into this, supply constrained time of year. And again, the big question will be what happens after the 4th of July? Do these volumes continue?
Yeah, it's interesting, Zach, because you're exactly right. We've been talking about this for a while, and you were on freight forecasting, and maybe you'll join me again this Thursday and try and break down this a little bit further because it has broken away from the seasonality. We were watching everything, and it was acting very seasonal. And we would expect right now to be coming off this kind of hump going into the holiday, the 4th of July holiday, kind of softening a little bit. Nothing drastic, but it usually softens a bit, and you usually start to see tender lead times increase. And it's doing the exact opposite right now.
Yeah, and lead times themselves still moderated down at 2.6 days. Not necessarily that unusual at this time of year. Normally we start to see those lead times really take a substantial leap later as we approach July 4th. So again, I would say by Wednesday, Thursday, if those lead times aren't expanding dramatically, we're definitely going to see something new there, especially on the capacity end. But again, we're not seeing a lot of that freight being pushed into next week either. It's still staying right around where it is on the lead time end. Tender rejection rates expanding rapidly now. We're now seeing pretty robust growth on the tender rejection side, whereas up until about the first half of June was really a slow grind. We saw those tender rejection rates kind of creep up slowly from about 5% to 7%. From June 1st to June 14th. Now we're up over 14.5% on the tender rejection rate. And that second half, and you're talking about in the last 14 days or so, this is the rate of increase has just expanded dramatically. Now we're sitting right in the middle of where we've been over the last 2 years in terms of tender rejection rate. This time in 2018, tender rejection rates were up around 25%. This time in 2019, 5.91%. So we're, splitting the difference there to an extent. So again, every single year appears to be different, and obviously this one is proving to be the consummate case of that.
We have a question here from Stefan Nico from Blue Grace. He's a pricing operational analyst, and he's talking about volumes, going back to volumes. OTVI right now is near March highs. Will we see a drop-off in the beginning of Q3 similar to April and May?
I would assume that we would see some level of drop-off. Now, I don't think that that's going to translate to some sort of dramatic fall like we saw in March of this year, but I do think that we will see some sort of softening. Now, to the extent, I'm not really sure anymore. We'll have to watch here over the next couple of days. If we don't see any dramatic, substantial moderation in terms of volume growth, I think we might actually be entering a time period where we see a more robust growth period, and these volumes may actually be sustainable through July. And I think some of that indication is being supported by, you know, a lot of these supply chains are scrambling to get freight in the right positions. We wrote about it this weekend, where we have this disconnect from macroeconomic indicators, really, you know, as suppliers and shippers are trying to get product in place before demand, or just to be ready for demand, and just get their operations up and running again, which is not that connected to that endpoint retail figure or even that industrial production orders number. So there's this space in the middle that appears to be very active right now.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with what you're talking about. I think that it's to answer the question from my own opinion, which is slightly different than yours. I think because I see it going down a little bit more in more like August. I think end of July, beginning of August, we start seeing those outbound tender volumes. But we can discuss that at another time. But so Travis Hamden had asked a question from Condesa Freight, talking about the recent or the recovery over the last few weeks of the Laredo, El Paso markets, et cetera. Zach, do you have any opinion on that? I tend to think it's along the same lines of that kind of pull forward and expectation, and not necessarily that the economy is actually pulling it.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely with that. You know, you've got these factories that are turning back on, these production cycles that are now trying to ramp back up, but we also have a massive shift in behavior by the population. So as everybody's changing the way that they live their life, the way they operate, businesses are having to adapt to that as well. You're seeing a lot of people scrambling, trying to position themselves in the best possible way to deal with, you know, their new environment. You know, auto manufacturers, of course, a lot of that cross-border traffic has influence with the auto manufacturers, and even though car demand may be down in terms of year-over-year numbers, they still haven't been producing vehicles, you know, significantly over the last little bit. So a lot of those factories are going to have to ramp up production just to get back to zero, even though demand may still yet be down year-over-year. They're still having to ramp up production, so it's increasing the need for a lot of these parts. And again, some of these factories haven't been operational for a couple of months. They're having to work from behind. They got a lot of back orders to catch up with. So I think that your theory about, you know, August being a big telling month in terms of whether or not these volumes sustain or not is going to be a big one, as these OEMs really struggle to get back online.
I think he might have accidentally agreed with me at that moment right there. I think he did. So what do you? But to further that point, just really quick. I'm sorry, Kevin, but when Steve Ferrari when he speaks, hello, Boomer, right?
Okay, Boomer. Yeah.
When he speaks, I tend to listen a little bit. He's a pretty smart guy, and he's talking about ocean is plummeting. Demand for ocean is plummeting. How does that? I mean, we're talking about, you know, even this morning on FreightWaves Now, you're talking about Southern California, and I don't disagree with this statement. It's becoming a bit of a bellwether for volumes, but isn't it supported mostly by imports coming through there rather than manufacturing in Southern California? And how does this 80,000, June 24th to June 27th, 80,000 ocean invoices, June 27th to the 30th, which is today, it was 40,000, half.
Yeah, so if you're asking the question, how does it make sense that we're seeing lower import volumes, yet we're seeing increasing volumes out of Southern California?
I don't know. No, because I think it's a time thing. I think, well, how does that bode for you know, that outbound volume in that Southern California continuing to be a bellwether into the next month, right? Well,
it still bodes well to be a bellwether, because that just means that we need to watch out for these volumes to drop all of a sudden, because eventually, you know, they'll run out of inventory. I think what we're seeing a lot of right now is a lot of domestic freight moving, you know, between hands, but there is still a very significant shortage of, you know, freight in terms of stuff that's coming into the country right now. I mean, you can look on Amazon, Wayfair, any of that, you know, just by anecdotally talking to suppliers out there, they don't have a lot of the parts available to meet the new demand for a lot of these new products. So if they don't have the inventory in their warehouses, eventually, if we're not filling it back up, you have to think that even if demand does rise back to wherever it was, they may not have the freight to move at that point.
Very interesting, and that's what we were talking about, how this stutter-start economy can actually, you know, you have this freight flow through, and then the orders stop, but then demand picks up, and it's not coming again. It starts to start and stall, and that's where you start to move from a swoosh or a V to a W type of thing, right?
And like gas brake, gas brake.
Yeah, yeah.
I love it. Thank you so much for your analysis today, Zach. And we'll switch gears a little bit, go from the freight markets to the economy and some of the numbers that have been released over the last few days. A lot of it's about consumer spending. We're seeing some differences with that and some activity there, aren't we, Anthony Smith?
That's right, Kevin. We got some new data from the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, over Friday. So what we saw was that there was indeed an increase for consumer and personal income. So what we saw was that consumer conditions actually increased. We saw that the personal income took a dip, last Friday's report, but spending increased 8.2% on a month-to-month basis. And so what that spending is really indicative of what happened throughout that month. What we saw was that one-time check that many were able to take advantage of and receive for $1,200, or kind of variable depending on what that household income takeaway was. Of course, with children, kind of changing things as well. But again, personal income took a dip, but spending went up. And so what we're seeing from that was that there was indeed a lot of pent-up demand after coming off a full lockdown in April. But right now, what we're seeing was that there was a little bit of opening of borders for some of these economies throughout the country, that we really saw a lot of influx in spending from that increased pent-up demand. But the fact of the matter is that there are still millions of people out of work right now. And with personal income down on a month-to-month basis, there's still going to be a lot of headwinds. One of the other things that we just saw come out was the consumer confidence numbers that just got released that did show that there was a 3-month high for overall consumer confidence. But again, as I said, there are still headwinds. One of the things that we're seeing now in many states, Florida, Texas, Arizona, is that they're starting to peel back or really slow down the reopening plans, or starting to kind of really kind of put back some regulations. So I know in Arizona, they're starting to stop gyms, restaurants, bars, and other areas that are really kind of high traffic areas, to really kind of peel back a lot of foot traffic. And so what we're seeing is that there is potentially more headwinds in the future. So we see this 3-month high for consumer confidence. This could be a short-lived thing if more states are to come with more of these implications.
Yeah, the headwinds are
they were
pretty strong at this particular. When was the consumer confidence index was? When was that released? What month was that measuring?
Yep. So that was for the most recent month of June. So from the Consumer Conference Board, and that did show it was a double-digit tick up, I think, to 98.3 or so, somewhere in that 98 range. Still below pre-pandemic levels. So pre-pandemic, I think around February, the number was around 130 or so. And so still a ways to go. But again, if this was taken and finished, of course, before and finalized before we start to see a lot of these other states kind of peel back. So it's going to be interesting to see how this affects consumer confidence moving forward. Is this going to be indeed a lagging indicator for the real-time activity that's happening right now, as more states either weigh the options of reopening too soon, or kind of modulating some industries, or taking it on a county-by-county basis? But this is going to be something that's really going to be telling for many Americans throughout the country. Now, with a lot of these companies, with a lot of these industries kind of peeling back, this is also going to have implications for those that were returning to work. And so that's also going to kind of play a role into potential some of the unemployment or jobless claims numbers that might be coming out in the coming weeks. So this has a lot of implications, not only for the consumers, but for the movement of freight that are carrying and hauling consumer-facing goods. And this also has implications for one of the areas that we were watching closely, housing. With consumers not feeling as confident if they have more restrictions, those that were on the lower propensity to buy are going to be even less likely to buy. Those that weren't even in the conversation now for buying, that were maybe barely making ends meet with rent prices right now, are going to be in pretty big trouble right now, because one of the things that a lot of people are worried about that were struggling to meet rent were evictions. Although some states are eliminating any type of evictions, a lot of people are worrying about what after. And so after the pandemic, are they going to be responsible for all of the months missed? Or once the pandemic is over, are we going to be met with a mass eviction flood? So there are a lot of things up in the air right now. Of course, we'll be monitoring this closely, and of course, seeing how this is going to affect the freight markets overall.
Sounds to me like there might be some cause for another round of stimulus, Anthony. You follow that opinion or no?
That is certainly a possibility. I know there is still a lot of resistance on what that stimulus package might look like, whether it be the exact same as the most previous one for $1,200. I'm in the opinion is if there is, of course, a substantial second wave that is affecting many Americans, this could be something that could be feasible, of course, to kind of prop up many Americans that are going to be in need. But I think there were indeed a lot of inefficiency problems that happened in the last time, whether that be checks being sent to those that have been deceased, or checks being set aside for those that are incarcerated. So there were a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of slip-ups in the last checks that were sent out. So I would imagine that if there were another round of stimulus funds sent out, that there would have to be a little bit more stipulations around this one. So definitely a lot up in the air, and we will continue to monitor the situation.
Thank you so much for those economic insights, Anthony. And again, that's Anthony Smith, our lead economist here at FreightWaves. And we have a special guest here at the bottom of the hour joining us from Freightos, and that's Judah Levine.
Judah Levine, research lead at Freightos Group. How you doing, Judah?
Hi, good. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Hey, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it very much. Can't wait to hear some of the insights there. Can you give us a little quick background on yourself, Freightos, and then let's jump in a little bit on COVID-19 impact on volumes and the rates really passed through the first half, I guess, of 2020.
Yeah, for sure. So Freightos, Freightos.com has a freight marketplace that connects shippers, mostly SMBs, with multiple freight forwarders to book multimodal freight online. And we also do a lot of different products in terms of freight digitization for forwarders and carriers, rate management, enabling e-booking, things like that. In addition, with all this data that we have access to through these other items or products, we also have the Freightos Baltic Index, which is what we're going to use to kind of talk about what's going on so far. And the Freightos Baltic Index, FBX, is a daily index for spot rates for containerized ocean freight for 40-foot containers, FEUs. And we can really use the FBX to kind of look at, tell us the story of what's happened so far in these first 6 months of this very unusual year. So if we take the China-U.S. West Coast lane as an example, we can see how COVID's impact on the global economy has played out on logistics, and specifically in ocean freight by looking at what's done to rates. So there's really been kind of 3 chapters to what's gone on so far. There was the shutdown of the economy in China from basically end of January through March, mid-March. There is the shutdown of the U.S. economy in April and May. And then we have what's happened this past month in June. We've seen a dramatic spike in ocean rates that we'll talk about. So just really briefly, if we talk about the beginning of the year, the shutdown of the economy in China, it coincided with the Chinese New Year as COVID took hold there. So rates were already relatively high as there's demand leading up to Chinese New Year, U.S. importers trying to get orders out before the week-long holiday. And that was kind of extended through February and then to mid-March as there was just nothing coming out of China as everything was, as many things were shut down. And we saw rates drop from about $1,600 per FEU in January down to $1,300 in February. So this is a drop of about 20%. But then Chinese manufacturing recovered really towards the beginning and middle of March. And as that happened, U.S. importers wanted to rush and get those backlogged orders out. And what that did was this increase in demand pushed rates up 15% in the first couple weeks of March. So it went up from this low of $1,300 up to $1,500. And then at that point in March, Expectations were that this rise is going to continue as U.S. importers are trying to restock inventories and continue clearing that backlog and continue moving on to normal seasonality. But of course, unfortunately, COVID started to have an impact in the U.S. Right around then, late March and beginning of April. And so what we saw then was a leveling off. And this is kind of where things got a bit tricky. So as the U.S. economy was impacted, we would have expected, so we knew that U.S. Consumer demand fell and demand for imports fell. And we might have expected freight rates to fall as well. And that kind of brings us to the next part of the story, that freight rates really leveled off and they kind of plateaued from March through May. There was only a 7% increase during that entire part of the shutdown, and that brought us back up to $1,600, like we were back in January. So the question is, why was there this leveling off if this demand has dropped? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, they dropped this, and this is where they started blanking sailings, right?
Exactly. So that's the part of the story. So you might have expected, demand has dropped, import volumes are dropping. You would have expected that rates would drop as well. But that's not what happened. So ocean carriers, really across the main alliances, were able to remove capacity, reduce the supply of ocean capacity by canceling or blanking sailings. And by doing this, they reduce their costs from not sailing half-empty ships, and they also prevent rates from collapsing for those ships that do sail just by laws of supply and demand, reducing the amount of supply that's there. So the carriers across the major alliances, they blanked a record number of sailings. So there were 105 sailings from Asia to the U.S., both East and West Coast, from April to June, which was 9% of sailings in April, 19% in May. So for May, for example, that was 47 out of almost 250 ships, and then another 15% in June. And so by doing this, they were able to keep ships that were sailing pretty full, so there was good utilization, and that kept rates steady, this plateau we saw through April and May. And rates were relatively high, but year over year, they weren't significantly higher. So we had a situation where even in this low demand environment, rates stayed up, containers kept moving, and carriers, a few of whom already were really feeling the financial impact of this drop in volumes, were able to reduce losses. But we have to remember, even with the rates that were healthy, volumes were down. Right, so there were more than estimated about 7 or 8% decrease in volumes from January to April year over year, and this included about and then there was about a 20% decline in May. So we said almost 20% of sailings were blanked, and that translated into approximately a 20% drop in volume. And again, these knock-on effects to the kind of activity and volumes that ports in the U.S. were feeling, and then, of course, onto rail and road. So that kind of brought us through May, through our second chapter.
How about going on? So we're closing out the second quarter right now, moving into the third quarter. What are your expectations for both demand from American retailers and companies, as well as carrier capacity?
Right. So that brings us to June, and these moves had kept rates steady. Then we got to June, and for multiple reasons. One of them probably being that many states started loosening restrictions. There was an expectation that the economy was going to open up and consumer demand with it somewhat. There was an unexpected increase in demand for exports. For U.S. importers. And meeting that already really tight capacity, this bump in demand just caused rates to go through the roof in the month of June. So remember, rates were about $1,600 in February. In January, they got back to that point in May. But then the first 3 weeks of June's rates went up to a peak of $2,640 per FEU, which was a 65% increase over May. It was the largest monthly increase recorded in the FBX. It surpassed the previous record of 2,600, which we saw in November of 2018, which was in this pre-ordering kind of frenzy ahead of the introduction of tariffs. So just to give some perspective on how high that was. So again, why did this happen? There are different reasons of why, or analysis of why, what drove this demand. But because capacity was so tight, it sent rates going way up. So in terms of looking forward, so this increase in volumes and is definitely going to see an increase in volumes that are going to be of containers to be handled at U.S. ports in the coming weeks, certainly through probably already and certainly through July. What does this mean in terms of consumer demand? That's a really good question. And what we can say is in terms of how the carriers, the ocean carriers, are responding to this. So we're already seeing fewer cancellations. So if you look towards Q3 compared to Q2, there are already very many fewer blankings being announced. So if we look at July and August, we see at this point there are only 20 or so blank sailings announced already. So about 6% of ships in July and 3% in August. That was compared to 15% in June. And already this week, Hapag-Lloyd, for example, are reinstating 5 of their China to U.S. Sailings that were canceled. So this could be an expectation, at least on the carriers' expectations, that this bump in volume that we saw in June is going to be sustained. And this week we saw prices level off. So, we had the skyrocketing through the month. Now they're staying level. It could be that demand is leveling off. But staying, at this level of a certain amount of recovery. But we're also seeing more capacity added to the market, which may mean that carriers are, expecting a return of peak season or some form of peak season. But this, from other analyses or projections, like from the Retail Trade Federation, expectations are still of double-digit drops throughout the next few months. So. The fact that carriers are adding more capacity or not reducing capacity as much, maybe and some optimism that there's going to be a peak season and some of these volumes will return. It could also be a way of trying to avoid this kind of mismatch of supply and demand that we saw in June that really sent rates very high. Also, was unpleasant for shippers to have to pay these very high rates. And also there's a lot of rolled containers of shipments that just there wasn't enough space to get on the ship, and then our delays of up to 2 weeks from what we were hearing. So it may be that more capacity will be removed throughout the rest of the summer.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
very interesting, Judah. Because we had volumes actually in early mid June that were above 2018, 2019 as far as imports.
Yep.
And now they've really since around the 18th of June, volumes total into the U.S. imports have been coming down. Maritime specifically, though, have been coming down, and now they've dropped a bit. And we have the FBX in Sonar, so we're watching that, and people can use that and kind of look to those different things. It still the pricing is still quite elevated. I guess the question or the issue is, as we move forward, these alliances have to figure out how to adjust that capacity based on the demand and to keep their customers happy, right? But also, and to keep supply chains moving, but also they've got to figure out, are they going to get into a pricing war here somewhere and really get themselves hurt or not, right? And that's one of their major concerns, correct?
Right, for sure. And, that's kind of what we've seen if you look back at the financial crisis in 2008, that's what they're trying to avoid. There was a lot of fallout afterwards of dropping demand and things like that. And so I think the consolidation in the industry since then has allowed them to really work through the alliances to really work in an orchestrated way. And I think all of them want to avoid that kind of price war, and so far they have. The reduction of the amount of blank ships that are being announced ahead of time shows that they don't want to get into the situation that they saw just now with that mismatch, and to avoid that unpleasantness. But that can cause other problems, because with less warning or with less advance notice, that can cause other problems for forwarders, for shippers as well. So. There's so much uncertainty. There's so much that's unknown. It's unknown exactly, how the pandemic is gonna play out and how it would affect consumer demand, which makes it difficult for businesses to know when to order or not, which in turn makes it difficult for the carriers to predict what kind of capacity they need to keep on the market for their own businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating stuff. I could go on forever. And unfortunately, we've gone actually way over time with you, Judah, but I appreciate you being on. It was good stuff, and and very, very informative. We'll do this again soon, right, Judah?
Sounds good. I'd love to.
Excellent. So how do people reach out and learn more about Freightos before we say goodbye?
Yeah, you can find us at Freightos.com, and you can also find us at fbx.freightos.com, specifically for ocean rates or to sign up for our weekly update. Thank
you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
I mean, I could dig into that all day long. It fascinates me trying to figure that. Oh, yeah, I have a ton more questions, but
now we're going to switch to the final mile and Amazon's acquisition on Friday, or announcement of acquisition on Zeus. And joining us now is Steve Viscelli, who is from the University of Pennsylvania. Fellow and lecturer there, talking about his specialty is final mile. Can you give us a brief introduction for yourself, Steve?
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. I'm a sociologist, which surprises some that I would focus on freight, but I spend my time talking to drivers and really thinking about the process of actually moving freight and the impacts of technology. So my previous work was on long haul. My current project is on last mile delivery and the ways that e-commerce is changing, creating new kinds of work and then changing existing work for delivery drivers. So I'm interviewing drivers across the spectrum from Postal Service, UPS, FedEx, new Amazon initiatives like DSP, as well as Flex.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. So what are the major trends, right? I guess let's back up and talk about the Amazon announcement of acquisition of basically autonomous driving technology with Zoox. Can you explain a little bit more in detail their strategy with that?
Yeah. Well, I wish that I could, and I think others wish that they could as well, because there are big questions around what the role of automation is going to be in last mile. Not involve a lot of driving, right? Unlike long haul, where you have long stretches of uninterrupted driving, last mile is really about getting the packages out of the van and to the door. That's the bulk of what the driver's doing. A good dense route in last mile, which is what Amazon's really aiming for. The vehicle may not move more than 20, 30 miles once it's on that route. So the driving task is really not the big chunk of what you would want to automate. And so it leads me to think that the self-driving aspect of it is not what they're really after. It's a broader program of automation and artificial intelligence for making last mile delivery more productive. And it is hugely labor intensive right now and getting more so.
Yeah, it's highly it's cost inefficient. It's highly costly, a difficult operation to run the final mile. And when I saw that, I was like, what are they thinking? I mean, the final mile is like the last place anybody thinks that autonomous vehicles are going to be adopted first, right? You would think the long haul and then maybe some regional type of stuff, these regional moves. Of course, inside ports and rail yards, et cetera, makes sense because it's a defined environment and you can define the expectations of that vehicle, right? But final mile through my neighborhood or your neighborhood, Kevin, or yours, Steve, would be a difficult thing to do. So that last step then is where you always hear about drone technology making that happen, right? I mean, it can't be bots or something like that. It's not a terrestrial bot that's going to do it, right?
That is true. Not a terrestrial bot.
I wouldn't think.
No. Where do you see, Steve, where do you see areas that are ripe for automation, though, in that final mile or last mile segment?
Yeah, so I think, as I'm talking to drivers more, as I'm looking at more operations and how Amazon's getting the job done, you want a suite of options, right? So you may still have a van that goes out, fully loaded, like you have with UPS or and the emerging DSP volume that Amazon has been steadily building, right? And then automation may help you to increase the productivity of that that particular driver, right? But imagine this: maybe you have somebody out on a route, and that self-driving vehicle is then refilling the van, essentially, right? So maybe you're sending, this self-driving vehicle out with the next half of the route, or orders that have come in after that driver left for the day, right? That driver may leave the warehouse at 8 o'clock. The self-driving vehicle comes out at noon, right? Or supplements the work of a driver in rural areas. Or maybe, these self-driving vehicles are picking up rollover, and it's something that the customer can interact with. It's a rolling locker of sorts that comes to your house. And you've scheduled that, right? And so the customer's there. The onus is on them, right, to be there, to meet the thing, to pick it up. That's not going to work for a huge, chunk of what Amazon's moving right now. But that kind of automation could be part of the broader picture of the way that you get 100% of the packages moved, even if the self-driving vehicles are only moving, 15, 20% or something along those lines.
Now, Steve, you talked to a lot of drivers, a lot of final mile, last mile drivers. How are they holding up in these conditions over the last few months and going forward with COVID-19?
Yeah, it's really two big stories. One of which is, for those drivers who do have pre-existing health conditions or someone at home that they've been concerned about it. And for them, this has been a very stressful time of, along with the rest of us, of understanding, how contagious is a package, right? How am I likely to contract the virus? So there are inside the building issues for those drivers, and then there are the customer interactions and handling of the packages. That's really one set of issues. I would say a smaller segment of the driving force that's, the dominant concern. But for the vast majority of drivers, as they describe it, this is like the Christmas rush with no light at the end of the tunnel. The volume has just been so tremendous, and I get pictures from drivers of the back of their vans and say, look, this is not just, is it an extra hour, but my equipment's not designed to handle this. I've delivered 7 trampolines in the last 2 days. Normally I have a trampoline a month, right? Now, and we've had some really interesting debates about what is an essential item. So maybe mom and dad need that trampoline at home to keep themselves sane. And drivers welcome the work, of course. They welcome the overtime, but they for the most part, but they do wonder, is this sustainable? How do I stay safe? This is a very physical job. Which I think, as we see the U.S. Postal Service transitioning from a mail service to a parcel service, right, which is essentially what it's doing. You've got drivers in there who've been in there 20, 25 years, and they didn't sign up to drop off 300, odd-shaped and sized and weighted packages every day. And they're getting up in age, right? So, so these kinds of issues are just being magnified by both the increase in volume and the shift in what people are ordering, as well as, at least initially, a big shift from primarily business to residential deliveries for some drivers, where you had routes that were primarily commercial. And they just have a different setup. They have a different kind of package. They may have loading docks. They may have wheeled carts, and so now drivers are learning new neighborhoods. They're carrying odd items. So it's been challenging. And the question of, can they sustain this, workload for 6 months, 9 months is a big one.
Thank you very much, Steve. This is Steve Viscelli. How do people contact you, learn more about your research and what you're doing there at the University of Pennsylvania?
Yeah, my personal website is steveviscelli.com would be the easiest way to get in touch with me, and shoot me an email. I love talking about last mile delivery.
Thank you very much,
awesome.
Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, guys.
It's very, very interesting stuff. Final mile and how it's going to be solved during this and how they're going to become efficient it's still going in many different directions.
Yeah,
because Amazon was looking at their bots that actually did go down the sidewalk, right, and deliver stuff, right? And is it Zoox? Mm-hmm. So Zoox is building autonomous cars from the ground up for ride sharing, for ride hailing services, and Amazon claims that is why they purchased them, is to keep that going. But then I'm sure they're looking at as how do they solve the final mile delivery, right? But how do you do that without it being central locations and going to each house?
Yeah, and the driver point of view was very interesting as well, because it is like a holiday season with no end in sight. So we'll see how that plays out over the second half of the year, which starts tomorrow. But before we do any of that, let's hit some good news, and it comes from Amazon. Amazon had a great news about $500 million going to where, Michael?
Yeah, that's right. So what's good is Amazon is doling out $500 million thank you to workers. A $500 million thank you to workers. In a brief statement on the company's blog, day one, Amazon announced COVID-19 related bonus payments totaling $500 million. The payments to frontline employees and partners are as follows. Full-time Amazon and Whole Foods Market employees and delivery service partner drivers will receive $500, while their part-time counterparts will get $250. All leaders in the frontline positions at Amazon and Whole Foods Markets will receive $1,000. Delivery service partner owners will receive $3,000. Ride-sharing last-mile drivers with Amazon's Flex will receive $150 if they work more than 10 hours in June. Our frontline operations teams have been on an incredible journey over the last few months, and we want to show our appreciation with a special one-time thank you bonus totaling over $500 million, stated Dave Clark, Senior Vice President of Worldwide Operations. In a separate blog, the company said that it has funded approximately $4 billion in COVID-19 initiatives. Amazon faced pushbacks in its handling of its worker safety earlier on in the pandemic. We reported some of those. We had some of those issues there. But good news from them and doing things right and rewarding those people for sticking it out and being out there and being on the front lines, right?
Exactly right. Those final mile, last mile drivers especially are going to see a bonus for all the hard work they've done over the last 3 months. And as Steve said, no light at the end of the tunnel yet.
Yeah, but Christmas season with no end.
I know. So what's ahead on FreightWaves TV? This week, 2 o'clock, Andrew was talking about his episode of Great Quarter Guys, him and JP Hampstead, talking about the outlook for 3PLs in the third quarter. That'll be 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then noon tomorrow, Put That Coffee Down, the Freight Sales Podcast. Dooner and I will have Ryan Schreiber from Carry Direct on to talk about job postings, interviewing, being both the interviewee and the interviewer, and kind of trends and things that you should ask and things that you shouldn't ask, and warning signs or red flags in job postings that's a little bit sketchy. So identifying those. So that's going to be noon tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then 2 p.m. is Freightonomics with Zach Strickland and Anthony Smith, where they break down the freight markets with an economic spin to it. And
I may have both of those guys on freight forecasting tomorrow or on Thursday at 4 p.m.
4 p.m. Wednesday we have with Sonar.
Oh, that's true. That's true. We do.
Luke and Kyle talking about Sonar, and then noon we're back here at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and then 4 p.m. is
on Thursday is freight forecasting. Yeah, I was saying I might have Anthony and Zach back on. Just take one more look at beyond the 4th, right before we go into the 4th of July holiday, because it is it's exciting to see things moving and the volumes going up, but you see all these headwinds and it can't. You wonder how can it sustain and how far down will it drop? How will it go down? And then you see you see these states kind of rolling some things back, and now you see that the European Union, their travel plans bans U.S. Citizens from traveling to Europe because of our current outbreak and so on and so forth. So you figure how's that can affect consumer demand, consumer sentiment, and the economy. I don't
think we have a Friday edition of What the Truck because of the holiday, but you guys did your Monday edition yesterday.
We did. We talked about the Badger versus the Cybertruck, Nikola versus Tesla a little bit there, talking about those, but also Trailer Bridge. We did some Play It Forward. We had so Lance Healy was on playing his harmonica, and we had a guitar player on as well, and so you can check that out on FreightWaves TV.
Yeah,
it was fun.
Yeah, I bet you Dooner picked the Cybertruck, right?
He did.
He did, yeah. Very good. Well, this wraps up for this edition of the Midday Market Update.
Peace and love.